Over time, Russia may end up pivoting the entirety of its energy resources towards the emerging markets and economies of it.
You know what's funny? I said a couple weeks ago, and I know I'm not like the number one guy in lefty entertainment when it comes to geopolitics. I make, you know, a huge amount of mistakes. I try my best, but my read of a lot of this was that I think the person who's going to, well, not the person, but the country that's going to come out the best from all of it is going to be China. Ultimately, if China can maintain a rather neutral position, not directly taking the side of Russia, but also not directly taking the side of either NATO or the United States, while at the same time secure vast amounts of energy sales from Russia that would otherwise be going to Europe, that would be a best case scenario from their perspective, I would think.
Clashes followed a campaign of aerial bombardment.
How can I find you?
Bombings, too, at the other airports and military sites.
More than 200,000 Russian soldiers, along with their guns, tanks, trucks, and planes, surged across the Ukrainian border along 3 different fronts. And in the weeks since, the world as we knew it before has been forever and irreversibly changed in countless ways. As Vladimir Lenin once said over a century ago, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. While the Russian invasion will certainly have numerous, enormous consequences that'll be felt by nearly every single country around the world, it's obvious that none will experience more severe consequences than Ukraine itself. Their country is the one being invaded, bombed, besieged, and destroyed as I'm speaking. And their country is the one whose very existence Vladimir Putin has now openly called into question. While the extent of the damage is unclear for the moment, after all, the dust has eventually settled, it will no doubt be horrendous. Ukraine will experience reverberations of this trauma for generations to come. And from the perspective of the Kremlin, the invasion is most likely not exactly going according to their initial plans. Putin and the Russian military clearly underestimated the ferocity of Ukrainian resistance, while they also placed too little of an emphasis on their own logistics and supply chains. The conflict is likely dragging on longer now than they initially anticipated, and that is a very dangerous situation. Because with Western sanctions pouring in, the Russian military is in a race against the clock before they basically go bankrupt. And in order to try and force a surrender faster, they may begin utilizing even more of their destructive and indiscriminate firepower, like concentrated artillery or air power, which they so far have largely been holding back. And when that happens, the destruction and refugee crisis, already the largest in Europe since the Second World War, will only continue getting worse. As it stands now, when I wrote this video, more than 2.5 million Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have been forced to flee the country as refugees, primarily towards the west in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Moldova. If the war ends up dragging into a protracted conflict, the UN has estimated that there could be as many as 10 million Ukrainian refugees fleeing westwards to the rest of Europe, which will be enormously catastrophic. To put these figures into some kind of perspective, during 2015, when Europe was undergoing the so-called migrant crisis from the Middle East and North Africa, the continent saw 1.3 million refugees coming in over the course of the entire year. There have now been nearly twice as many Ukrainian refugees as that in a matter of weeks, and it could be nearly 10 times as many. And at the same time as the refugees have been leaving, equipment, supplies, weapons, and thousands of foreign volunteers have been pouring in from dozens of countries across the world in order to help Ukraine's fight for survival. It's also worth remembering that we're only a few weeks into this conflict so far, and wars are often fought and won over the course of months or even years. It is still far too early to tell how this is all going to go. But should Putin's Russia manage to emerge victorious, it has the potential to completely upend the entire order of Europe. With the flurry of sanctions, travel bans, airspace restrictions, mass arrests within Russia, and more over the past few weeks, it truly appears that a new Iron Curtain is descending across the European continent. This time,
you know what's wild about this map right here is this is basically what people like Infrared has, Caleb Maupin, and Duginists, anyone who's been kind of studying or following the work of Alexander Dugin. This is what they point towards as being this new unifying collection of new Eurasia, which is going to take on the old paradigm and this new multipolar world dynamic that we have, where there's not just one hegemonic superpower, which is basically the United States and a partnership with NATO, but now there's going to be a new collection of countries that are going to take on and challenge that very structure itself.
shifted over slightly to the east from where it was before, from Kaliningrad on the Baltic to the Ukrainian shores on the Black Sea. It is beginning to appear that the Cold War in Europe between the West and Moscow, once believed to have ended for good back in 1991 when people like Francis Fukuyama unilaterally declared the end of history, merely instead took a 30-year break.
Look at that long-ass border with Finland. Yeah, that's pretty aggressive.
And has now, once again, returned to haunt us all. The evidence of this is manifold and all around us. Historically neutral, recent polls in both Sweden and Finland have shown that the majority of the population in both countries is now in favor of joining the NATO alliance for the very first time. Both governments have expressed some form of interest, and Moscow has directly threatened them both with some kind of action should they dare to proceed. Of course, Finland's admittance into the alliance would be particularly controversial, owing to their large land border with Russia and their proximity with St. Petersburg, Russia's second largest city and the hometown of Vladimir Putin. For decades during what I will now always refer to as the Cold War's first phase, the Soviet Union essentially bullied Finland into always staying neutral between East and West. And it seems as if old habits die hard. But among the greatest of changes ushered in by Putin's war in Ukraine is the revolution undergoing Germany, and specifically the German military and defense doctrine. During an incredible session of the German Bundestag just 3 days after the invasion, the new Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a series of earth-shattering measures. The German armed forces would receive a one-time $113 billion defense fund to rapidly modernize themselves, and from thereafter would receive a permanent annual budget increase to more than 2% of Germany's annual GDP. This means that their yearly budget will be increased to around $78 billion, causing Germany's military to suddenly become the third best funded in the world, only behind China and America. And critically, that means they'll be ahead of Russia's military budget. Very rapidly, the German army will likely once again, for the first time in nearly a century, take over the reins of being the most formidable on the European continent. And the geopolitical revolution goes even further beyond that. Germany has also agreed to send lethal aid to Ukraine, and most unexpectedly of all, they've even agreed to indefinitely suspend the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project that would have brought in even more enormous quantities of natural gas directly from the vast sources of Siberia and Russia. The cost to build this controversial pipeline was more than $11 billion. And so, of course, such a move will be difficult for the German economy to bear. But such is their result.
Don't feel bad, Germany. Canada could teach you a lesson or two about wasting money on pipelines that never get built. And let us quickly watch this funny video of Jason Kenney unable to even pump gas. I'm so happy this happened. I'm now going to pump my own gas, as I often do and know how to, because again, it's something that I frequently do myself, fellow oil lovers. That didn't work out quite like you had planned, did it, Kenny?
In showing solidarity with Ukraine. This is all quite unexpected and unprecedented because right up until the actual invasion, Germany was hesitant to actually support Ukraine and come out hard against Russia, because Germany is critically over-dependent on Russian natural gas. Even without the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, with limited domestic energy resources of their own, Germany has had no other choice but to import nearly the entirety of her energy needs from abroad. And with some of the largest natural gas and oil reserves in the world, geographically nearby Russia has always been the most significant provider. Through a complex series of pipelines that have been constructed over decades sprawling out from the vast oil and gas fields in Siberia, Russia directly provides Germany with a third of her oil and half of her natural gas. And the same is true for much of the rest of Europe as well. Italy and France also import significant amounts of Russian fossil fuels. And the closer eastwards the countries are to Moscow, the more fossil fuels they generally import. To the point where many nations like Bosnia, North Macedonia, Moldova, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Croatia, Czechia, and Austria import nearly the entirety of their gas from Russia. This is largely because, geologically, the European continent was not blessed with large amounts of oil or natural gas that power the modern engines of civilization. And instead, large amounts of these resources can be found all around the European Union's perimeter.
Whose video is this? It's Real Life Lore.
In the North Sea, between the UK and North.
They've been doing really good analysis so far of the situation, looking at it from usually a materials standpoint. I don't mean a materialist standpoint, but materials as in what exactly is the driving force behind this, what is the border size, complication. How is oil going to be transported? How is fuel going to be transported? It's usually trying to come at it from that perspective rather than the okay, here's the mythos that Putin is trying to paint, and he's saying that this is about denazification and this is the other side, and now we're going to do the veneration of Zelensky as the superhero, and we're going to do it's more just like, okay, so let's look at exactly where the energy is going to go, why it's driving forces and that kind of stuff, which is, to be honest, a pretty important way to kind of analyze this.
Across the Ural Mountains in Russian Siberia, in the eastern Mediterranean around Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt.
Unlike most European countries, we have conscription. The other Nordic countries don't. That's because we know our geography. Is there mandatory service in Finland as well? As in, like, you have to spend like 18 to 22 in the military getting training?
And of course, around the Persian Gulf. With critically few oil and gas resources themselves, the European Union is therefore critically addicted to the imports of Russian oil and gas flowing in from their pipelines, and it severely limits their abilities to actually confront Moscow's aggression. In order to overcome this dependency and energy insecurity, the European Commission has, since the invasion, outlined a 10-point proposal to make the EU completely independent from Russian fossil fuels by the end of the decade. But of course, that is going to take years to accomplish, and until it happens, every drop of oil and gas that Europe continues to buy from Russia will go directly towards funding the Russian war machine in Ukraine. The problem, though, is that there aren't really any easy alternatives for Europe to choose. Norway, the second largest provider of gas to the European Union, is already at maximum export capacity through their own pipelines and cannot provide any more than they already are. In theory, the EU could replace some of Russia's gas with liquefied natural gas or LNG imports coming in on tanker ships from friendly countries like the United States, Qatar, or Australia, but there are many problems with this strategy as well. First, Europe lacks a lot of the infrastructure that's required for importing LNG. In order to do so, they need LNG processing terminals at ports that can take in the LNG from container ships, turn the liquid back into its gaseous state, and pump that into pipelines. Unfortunately, Europe has very few of these LNG terminals existing right now, with only a handful in Portugal, Spain, Italy, France, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, and Greece, while major global economies like Germany, who import more than half of their gas from Russia, have zero. So in order to begin importing LNG at a large scale, the Germans will have to build brand new LNG terminals. But that is going to cost billions of dollars and take years to accomplish. Secondly, even if the EU had the infrastructure, the supply chain of LNG is already highly constrained as it is, and met by massive demand for it in Asian economies like China, South Korea, and Japan. If the EU suddenly began buying LNG at a large scale, then the price for everyone would increase dramatically. The EU could also rely a bit heavier on their own limited domestic sources of gas, but this too is highly problematic. The largest natural gas field within Europe, and one of the top 10 largest in the entire world, is right here, the Groningen field in the Netherlands. For decades, this field provided gas that powered much of the Netherlands and the rest of the continent, and in 2013, provided as much gas was extracted from it that flows through Nord Stream 1 towards Germany today. But the field's days are numbered. The extraction of gas from here caused wide-scale subsidence. That is, the sinking of ground beneath it.
So, just an extra addendum on Finland's conscription. Yes, obligatory, but you can get out of it for several reasons: to do civic service or without the weapons training, and women can also serve but don't have to. Oh, cool.
This phenomenon was further accompanied by significant earthquakes in the region of the northern Netherlands that damaged many houses and caused significant local unrest. Therefore, it was decided by the Dutch government nearly a decade ago to steadily phase the gas field out between 2014 and 2022, when production was supposed to halt entirely. But now, faced with the threat of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the dire need to get the continent off of Russia's gas supply, the Netherlands has decided to continue extraction in the field until as late as 2028, with unknown seismic consequences around Groningen and the northern Netherlands for the future. And there are precious few other alternatives for the European Union to make. In theory, new gas pipelines could be constructed into the continent from other sources like the gas fields around Israel and Cyprus in a proposed project called EastMed, or from the gas fields of Nigeria that would loop around the African continent towards Spain. But just like building out the LNG infrastructure, these projects will cost billions of dollars and take years to develop, and in the end, they'll each only substitute a fraction of the gas that Russia is capable of pumping into the continent. Meanwhile, and quite unlike Europe, the United States is tremendously geologically well endowed, with enormous quantities of domestic oil and gas resources across some of the—
I've never heard that sentence before. Geologically well endowed. Damn. You got big cock oil energy.
World's largest fields in Texas, Alaska, North Dakota, and northern Pennsylvania. Thus, a full 65% of America's oil and gas supply is produced domestically within the country, and America has tremendously more energy security than Europe does as a result, and thus substantially more flexibility when it comes to dealing with Russia. Therefore, it was a much easier decision when President Joe Biden decided to ban the imports of Russian oil and gas into America, since Russian fuels were only providing less than 2% of the total U.S. supply in the first place. America can easily replace the difference by banning Russian imports, whereas Europe simply cannot. Of course, the Russians do realize that by this point, their lucrative days of selling fossil fuels to the West are rapidly coming to an end, and in anticipation, have been massively pivoting their supplies and business towards Asia, where many major economies like China, India, and Pakistan have still so far declined to join in on any serious sanctions against Russia. Right now, Europe remains Russia's largest customer of gas by far, since they import around 200 billion cubic meters from them.
You know what's fucked up about all this is that when you really see just the raw dollars and cents of the whole exchange, this is about energy and energy sales and stuff like that, you start to recognize how much Ukraine and Ukrainians are getting fucked over in the process, where people are kind of like all playing like, well, okay, fine, why don't we cut off our oil supply from Russia? Well, at the same time, because we don't want to fuel the Russian war machine, because they're currently doing atrocious and horrifying things in Ukraine. That is also true. But at the same time, we're going to have to redirect where we get our energy from. So let's start looking at all these other regions here. Let's reconnect this, and hey, why don't we get the natural gas fields to get reignited, even though they were going to be retired, because now Europe is going to need a huge swell in energy that it didn't have before.
Per year. By comparison, right now, China only purchases around 38 billion cubic meters a year from Russia, which is primarily provided by the Power of Siberia pipeline here in the Russian Far East. However, in light of recent events, this will likely change very quickly. China has yet to become connected to the massive gas fields of northern Siberia that the Russians use to dump gas into Europe from, and under an agreement that is closer than ever now to fruition, a second pipeline called Power of Siberia 2 may be finally constructed from these very same fields directly to China's hungry industrial core around Beijing that'll double Russia's gas exports to China. Unlike the West, China will likely continue without passing any serious financial sanctions on the Russians, and quite to the contrary, will even provide the Russians.
So really, I mean, completely blacklisting, and for more moral reasons, right? You don't want to directly help fuel the war effort in Russia if you are part of Europe right now. So for Germany, cutting them off will not affect Russia's bottom line if Russia can effectively sell all of that excess natural gas to China, for example.
Government with investments into new pipeline infrastructure that flows towards Beijing, like Power of Siberia 2, because they want and need Russia's vast energy resources. And now that business in Europe is drying up, China senses an opportunity to make a good deal, while Russia sees the opportunity to simply shift business elsewhere. As a result, while the war in Ukraine is ripping apart all of the bonds between Europe and Russia, it also seems to be pushing Russia and China closer together from a financial and energy perspective. Over time, Russia may end up pivoting the entirety of its energy resources towards the emerging markets and economies of it.
You know what's funny? I said a couple weeks ago, and I know I'm not like the number one guy in lefty entertainment when it comes to geopolitics. I make, a huge amount of mistakes. I try my best. But my read of a lot of this was that I think the person who's going to, well, not the person, but the country that's going to come out the best from all of it is going to be China, ultimately. If China can maintain a rather neutral position, not directly taking the side of Russia, but also not directly taking the side of either NATO or the United States, while at the same time secure vast amounts of energy sales from Russia that would otherwise be going to Europe, that would be a best case scenario from their perspective, I would think.
Asia. And from China's perspective, whatever happens in Ukraine might provide invaluable insights into how a potential future Chinese invasion of Taiwan might go. At the same time as all of this has been happening, another fascinating way that the world is changing before our eyes over this war can be seen in the air.
I'm just kidding. No, it's true. And I'm sorry, baby blogger, that's true of all creators. Like, the ones who aren't willing to admit it are the ones who are just too far up their own ass in the ego land. But like, anyone who talks for a living live on a stream for like more than 3 or 4 hours a day and is having to analyze things in real time as they happen, it's just a human being. There's not like an editorial staff standing right behind me or hiding underneath the chair who are like, oh, by the way, Lance, you're actually factually incorrect on this one. And it turns out, like, after doing this, I don't have a Jamie. I don't have a Jamie off in the corner or maybe hiding in the closet there, just being ready to pull up stuff and facts and figures for me at a moment's notice.
Since the beginning of the war's outbreak,
Yeah,
Ukrainian
Chico's the
airspace
director,
has
true.
obviously been completely sealed off from the rest of the world, and international flights have all been avoiding it. But then, just a few days following the invasion and as part of their overall sanctions package, the European Union blocked all Russian airlines from flying over their airspace, followed up by similar declarations from Norway, Iceland, the
I do
UK,
have a hive-minded
Canada, and
chat.
the United
They're
States.
awesome.
In retaliation to these blockages, Russia also decided to ban the airlines of 36 countries from using their airspace, including all EU, British, Canadian, American, and Japanese airlines. As a result, Western airlines have largely stopped flying to Russia, while Russian airlines have largely stopped flying to the West. So while a physical Iron Curtain has yet to actually descend back across Europe on the ground, the Iron Curtain of the air is already very much a new reality again. Live flight radar maps are right now showing the airspaces of Russia and Europe as being completely separated, with a massive empty no man's zone in between them where nobody is flying over at all, covering the entirety of Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Western Russia, all the locations nearby to the war. Respecting the dangerous boundaries of war and the political airspace blockades, Russian airlines are sticking to their own flight corridors, while European airlines are sticking to theirs as well, across the new Iron Curtain of the sky. As the largest country in the world, Russia...
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think a lot of liberal checkmarks and journalists and reporters who seem to love being like, so when are we going to enact the no-fly zone? Or just like, the countries involved, luckily, the higher-ups, the people who are actually in charge of NATO and the United States, and Russia in this case, don't want war with each other. Russia would like to proceed without the direct conflict with the United States or NATO countries, obviously. I mean, everyone understands how powerful and frightening and dominating the American war machine is, especially on a global scale. Like, no one wants that. No one's like, you know what would really upgrade this engagement we have going here? Why don't we involve the U.S.? Yeah, that could be fun. Maybe this will be the moment we finally take them down. The American military machine is horrifyingly powerful.
Russia's geographic position on the map now represents a colossal barrier to the free flow of Western airlines around the world, and especially represents a huge geographic challenge to fly around for Western flights between Europe and East Asia. For example, just a few weeks ago prior to the war, Air France was operating a route between Paris Charles de Gaulle and Tokyo Narita that took them through a substantial amount of Russian airspace. And now, after the ban on using Russian airspace, they've had to start flying this new route to the south that adds 2 hours and 30 minutes more onto the total flight time. And there are dozens and dozens of examples just like this that have been forced to change over the past few weeks. Here's the old flight route on Lufthansa from Frankfurt to Beijing, and the new one. Here's the old route on Finnair from Helsinki to Bangkok, and the new one. And probably the worst of all, this route pre-war, the Japan Airlines operated between Tokyo and London. They used to travel west across Russian Siberia, and now instead is traveling east over Alaska, the Arctic Circle, and Greenland.
Look at this difference. Holy shit. It was like you had a direct line before.
Before finally arriving in London, which adds an extra 3 hours of total flight time to the journey. This geopolitical impact on the aviation industry over the past few weeks is not new, and it's pretty much an exact mirror of the old phase of the Cold War, back when the Soviet Union denied their entire vast airspace to Western airlines, just as Russia is doing now. During those times in the older Cold War, airplanes were far less fuel efficient than they are today, and so flights traveling between Japan and Western Europe over the Arctic Circle had to stop somewhere to refuel, and that primary refueling stop
This war screwed Finland's flights to Asia? Oh, I imagine so.
became Anchorage, Alaska. I already made an entire video covering the geostrategic importance
that might
of
be a good time to plug the Discord, everybody. If you want to always have the latest announcements for all things surf, including random surfy things, just join the Discord. And even if you don't participate in the Discord, it'll just give you a notification when like things go live or there's a video premiere or some random big event that's happening. Iceland has no standing army as well. As the only NATO member, their population is so small. They do have a coast guard and some US bases that aren't so active anymore. Oh, okay, interesting.
Anchorage's location, and that video has never been more relevant than it is now. When the Cold War abruptly took a pause in the early 1990s, and Russian airspace was finally opened up to the west, Anchorage's importance as a layover and refueling hub for flights between Europe and East Asia nearly evaporated. But suddenly now, after more than 3 decades, in the past few weeks with the resumption of Russia's airspace closure to the west, Anchorage might just be making a huge comeback. And the geostrategic location of Anchorage and Alaska is now even more important than ever, as many more international flights will likely begin making their long-awaited comeback flying above America's last frontier. But, interestingly, many airlines operating the same services have been made to fly extremely different routes because of all the different bans. Since many Asian airlines can still fly across Russia, they can now do what European, Western, and Japanese airlines cannot. While the Lufthansa flight from Frankfurt to Beijing now has to add hours of time flying to the south in order to avoid Russia, Air China doesn't have to, and they're still flying straight through Russia. In a similar vein, the Air France flight between Paris and Seoul must now—
That's really interesting. I never even thought about the economics of how this affects the aviation industry based solely on the fact that Russia happens to be this massive, and then yeah, it would be blocking off all other commercial flights going through its territory. Didn't even think about that one.
Fly the much longer and costlier route to the south, while Korean Air can still just fly straight through Russia. Thus, Western airlines are facing a serious economic disadvantage on all of these routes between Europe and East Asia when compared to their Asian counterparts, who are immune to the Russian airspace ban. And who knows how that's going to play out over time. At the same time, Russian airlines themselves are being affected as well by their own newly made geographic barriers. The primary Russian carrier Aeroflot has canceled all flights to Europe until further notice. And with the airspaces of basically all of Europe and North America now blocked off to them, Russian flights elsewhere have been seriously complicated. This Aeroflot flight from Moscow to Cancun, Mexico, for example, has had to change to a completely new route that carefully avoids European, Icelandic, Greenlandic, Canadian, and US airspace in order to reach its destination. But significantly more challenging from Moscow's geographic perspective is this: the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, wedged in between Poland and Lithuania. Completely surrounded by EU states and EU airspace, the airspace around Kaliningrad is now completely blocked off to Russian airlines. Before the ban, Russian flights between the exclave and the Russian mainland would simply fly in nearly straight lines between their destinations. But now, they have to all concentrate around St. Petersburg and thread a very narrow needle of open airspace that's allowed to them through the Baltic Sea in order to reach Kaliningrad. And none of this is to even mention the unprecedented and enormous sanctions that Western countries are pouring onto Russia, which will have devastating financial impacts on every Russian citizen for years or even decades to come. Further, I haven't even mentioned the dozens upon dozens of Western companies that have announced their pullouts from the Russian market. Like, most symbolically of all, McDonald's, who was among one of the very first Western companies allowed to open a store in Moscow back in 1990, when it was still a part of the Soviet Union. In the 30 years since then, McDonald's and Russia have built and developed an incredibly close relationship, with around 850 locations across the country that provide around 10% of McDonald's entire worldwide revenue. But then, in a matter of days, Putin's invasion of Ukraine completely wiped out what it took the company more than 3 decades to build, as McDonald's announced that the company would be closing all of their locations throughout the country. And the same story is true of dozens of other companies, from IKEA to Adidas to Netflix to Visa to Sony and so many others. The list is seriously enormous. And in response to all of these pullouts, the Russian government has threatened to nationalize the assets of all of them still remaining in Russia, essentially turning the page back to the command economy style of the Soviet Union. Of especially critical importance, however, are the maritime shipping companies Maersk and MSC, who've joined in pulling their shipping and logistics services from the ports of Russia. And this will only exacerbate perhaps one of the most major ways that this war is changing the world: the supply of food. You see, during normal times, Ukraine is the world's 5th largest exporter of wheat. And during 2020, they exported more than 18 million tons of it to countries across the world, but most importantly, to hungry countries across the Middle East and North Africa. 60% of Lebanon's wheat supply just prior to the war was being shipped in from Ukraine. And since their most major grain silos were all blown up back in 2020 during the Beirut port explosion, they only have 1 month worth of wheat reserves still remaining as of the writing of this video. And there—
Uh-oh. This video was written like a month ago, wasn't it? I know it was posted on March 31st, but that's not good.
they're in an extremely dire situation. Meanwhile, Egypt, with a population of more than 100 million people to feed and with scarce agricultural land of their own, is the world's largest importer of wheat. And an overwhelming 85% of their wheat imports come from just 2 places: Ukraine and Russia, who are currently at war. Understandably, with the Russian army currently occupying large chunks of Ukraine, including most of the country's ports, and Ukrainian farmers fighting on the front lines, the harvesting and shipping season in the country will be a difficult one this year. But it won't be much easier for Russia either. With enormous international sanctions, shipping companies leaving ports, and an increasingly unpopular war that is consuming—
What's really going to be devastating to Russians is their complete reliance on outside sources for electronics of all kinds.
consuming vast quantities of resources and money, Russia, who is usually by far the world's largest exporter of wheat, may struggle to ship out supplies to countries who need it as well. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for around a third of the entire world's wheat and barley exports. And as a result of the war and the sanctions hampering that third of the global supply, wheat and barley prices across the world have been skyrocketing. And countries that rely heavily on wheat coming in from the breadbasket of Europe are going to struggle to make ends meet.
And where this starts to get very scary for me, and I'm not trying to doom or pill any of you, but just my own analysis, is the closer that the situation creates extreme food insecurity as well as huge economic turmoil, that is when conditions are ripe for far-right authoritarianism to grow, cultivate, and expand in a number of countries. And that's where things start to become very frightening, because obviously you want to avoid that at all cost. But the march towards fascism in the failure of capitalism is one that, you know, you can start to see strong men popping up. Then they start othering what exactly is the cause of this. Why are the prices of wheat so expensive? Why is this so expensive? Well, it happens to be the Jews. Didn't you know that? Yes, it was the Jews all along. They are the ones who are controlling our wheat, etc., and you know how the rest of this goes.
War-ravaged Syria has already announced that it'll have to cut spending and ration bread. And then there's Yemen, already torn apart by an ongoing and brutal civil war that has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands and already facing a starvation situation. Yemen is the world's 12th largest importer of wheat, and nearly 40% of the country's wheat imports usually come from Russia and Ukraine. What are they going to do if 40% of their wheat supply gets wiped out this year, when they're already facing the prospects of a famine as it is? The consequences of Ukraine and Russia's wheat being blocked off from the global market will be profound and likely hugely unexpected. The last time that global wheat prices surged this high was more than a decade ago, back in 2010. And the steeply increased prices on such a vital commodity for much of the Middle East and North Africa led to public unrest that potentially partially contributed to the Arab Spring revolutions at the end of that year that saw titanic political shifts across Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and Syria. There's really just no telling how vastly the crisis—
I mean, the conflict in Syria is still ongoing like today.
Ukraine today could affect things like this going forward in the near future. But something that is clear now is that wars in the 21st century almost always have vast global consequences. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed Russia, Ukraine, and the world forever in more ways than I could ever convey in a 30-minute video on YouTube. But by analyzing how Putin and how Russia have behaved and fared before during times of war and crisis, we can likely figure out how this present conflict will ultimately go. The invasion of Ukraine is only the latest of several wars initiated by Putin's regime, and as the ferocity and intensity of Russian attacks on the country continue ramping up in scale, the scenes that we're all seeing in the news every day are beginning to reflect more and more the very first war that Putin led Russia through more than 2 decades ago in Chechnya. Today, Chechnya is a republic within Russia, and its leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, is a close ally of Putin's, who is deployed—
By the way, seeing his photos in like Jackson Hinkle and other people's banners and stuff, I was like, this dude does so much horrifying stuff that even like, you know, tankies online, you're usually like, yeah, just gonna take a step back. The war crimes are a little too intense, you know. Not gonna use that as my avatar anytime soon.
His own Chechen forces alongside of the Russians in Ukraine. But 3 decades ago, this was hardly the case. As the Soviet Union disintegrated, Chechen separatists declared their independence from Russia, and the Russian government fought a series of brutal wars to keep them under their control. The first war against Chechnya lasted for 2 years, and despite having overwhelming military superiority, the Russians largely failed to win because of poor morale amongst their troops and near universal opposition amongst the Russian public at home. 2 issues that are similarly crippling the Russian war effort in Ukraine today. After thousands of lives that were lost, the Russians signed a peace treaty and Chechnya was a de facto independent state. But then just a couple of years later, in 1999, after the rise to power in the Kremlin of an at the time unknown Vladimir Putin, the war resumed once again under his new command. Chechnya was devastated, and the capital Grozny was besieged and so thoroughly destroyed that in 2003, the United Nations called it the most destroyed city on Earth. Putin began his political career as the leader of Russia by violently subjugating Chechnya back beneath the control of the Kremlin. And as a result, it is one of the most important conflicts to know about in understanding the current war in Ukraine. But unfortunately, if I made a video about all of that on YouTube, the violent nature of the war would mean that it would become demonetized and age restricted, and as a result, there's simply just no way that you would ever see it here. So instead, I
Go to Nebula? Yeah, I thought of it. Anyways, that was an excellent video on that topic. I have more Russian coverage and stuff to show you. If you want to, please go to Real Life Lore, that YouTube channel. Give them, you know, the subscribe and the thumbs up for doing all that work and putting that together. I know it's a massive channel, but still takes a lot of work to get. And like, honestly, I don't even consider this in any way apolitical. I know some people might think that's why I prefer this, but I just really like seeing videos that analyze all this that's strictly from a material sense without putting the whole politics of this is about denazification, and then we know that there's Nazis and effectively there's the Azov battalion and this, but like, well, why don't we actually just look at the resources and what exactly that is going to do in terms of its effect on people, mass starvation, for example, if the wheat can't be distributed, how does the energy crisis affect different countries, stuff like that. I think that's a much better way of trying to understand all of this rather than think that it's simply about either you know, Hitler 2 come to rise or the denazification of Hitler 3 or something like that, right? Yeah, logistics is it's an underappreciated angle of analysis and conflicts. I completely agree with that statement. I also obviously recommend the podcast American Prestige for you. In the latest episode that just came out yesterday, they did a good job of kind of explaining what exactly is happening and what's going to happen next. So I'm just going to play a little bit of that while I find some good visuals to accompany it with.
One on Friday, the Russian Defense Ministry put out a statement wherein they said that the main objectives of the first stage of their military operation have generally been accomplished, and they will now focus their core efforts on achieving the main goal, the liberation of the Donbass. This is all kind of interesting because it's unclear what objectives they've actually accomplished, if any. But what they seem to be saying here is that they have they went in intending to degrade the Ukrainian military as much as possible, and then kind of downshift from a general invasion to a more focused operation that was just centered around probably not just the Donbass, despite their wording, probably the Donbass and, let's say, Mariupol and that southeastern coastline of Ukraine. Whether this comports with what the Russian war aim has been all along, or is an indication that they feel like they're not getting anywhere with, let's say, overthrowing the Ukrainian government or any wider aims, and they've decided to make a pivot while kind of, you know, retaining some level of deniability to say that this is what we were intending to do all along is unclear. I'm not going to try to say one way or the other, but certainly, you know, those are both possibilities. Now that feeds into go ahead, Danny. Sorry.
So I was going to say, you don't know what you're unwilling to make a prediction about whether this is real or not.
I mean, well, I think it's real, but and there's evidence, you know, today even the U.S. military was saying they've seen some pretty major troop movements around Kyiv that suggest the Russians are pulling forces back. But I can get into that after we talk about these peace talks. So, I mean, I think the shift in their operations is real. I'm not sure I know why they're doing it.
Not sure if you see the struggle that's going on behind the scenes from trying to like find clips of the news that aren't just showing just atrocious, horrifying war crimes, but then it just seems like there's so many piling up right now that it's kind of hard to find the moments of the news that aren't actually directly showing you images of that.
And my hotline to the Kremlin's still not working for some reason. So, you know, we'll just have to say it's happening, and I don't really know why it's happening.
But one thing that was interesting about that is I didn't know that they were already doing that kind of mission accomplished. Hey, by the way, we've achieved a lot of our goals in this and this. And so that could be an indication if that is the case. And it's happening once again. I just have to put on a different news source or something. But there isn't like any non-TOS war footage. But anyways, that is slightly in a strange way kind of encouraging if that is kind of this, we now have to do this faux posturing, especially to both, you know, our citizens and everyone, that we have actually been successful in our aims and goals here. And so that could be an indication that we're ready to negotiate that or potentially organize some form of a ceasefire. I know that NATO's been taken out of the question in terms of the negotiations going back and forth. There could be something in which there is a new European defensive alignment pack that tries to give Ukraine both some security but also assures Russia that this is not going to directly impact, say, the United States. which is, of course, I'm sure their fear. One of the bigger problems of the entire NATO-European alliance is, of course, the United States being a key part of it means that it was always going to be subject to that and the conditions of there being a large American presence globally as a result of it.
At this point, but it feeds into, Danny, as you talked about the peace talks. There was another round of face-to-face peace talks on Tuesday this week in Istanbul, and I should note that we're recording this Wednesday evening, so there's going to be a lot of time in here before the episode comes out for things to have changed, and apologies if anything we say is out of date. But
I never
was another
apologize.
round
That's just Derek. I specifically not apologizing.
All right, yeah, never apologize. Never
apologize.
So there was a big flurry after this.
Not sure what happened to Dan Simpson. The dude went crazy and was obsessed with Nazis in Ukraine. Never really watched the show, but he blocked me on Twitter because his tweets to Ukraine Nazi stuff. It doesn't make any sense to me. He seemed like the most chill person in the world. And then randomly on Twitter started posting things like Lance is funding money for Ukrainian neo-Nazis, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, what the hell? If that was your fear, why not DM me? Because again, I don't understand why people don't DM each other instead of always making things out into like, I'm now going to make this into the drama arc. And then he did some live stream where he was like going off about how Lance was funding Ukrainian neo-Nazis with a fundraiser and all this stuff. And the true story is that there was a person named Raf who is an activist. He's an immigrant himself. He's a refugee himself who was doing a fundraiser on Facebook. One of the images that he had chosen for the fundraiser that he made himself was, yes, that picture that's like Yikesy from the Azov Battalion. That was included in a list of like 10 different charities from people I had trusted, where I was like, hey, by the way, this invasion just began. Here's some lists of people who are like running charity streams. Like I was not involved in it. I did not start it. I did not create it. I didn't make the event or anything. And then once I found that out, I immediately talked to Raf, and I'm the one reason he got the whole thing shut down. Like he shut down the charity, he refunded the money, he did that whole thing online where it was like, hey, I apologize, I didn't know that my picture was offensive, all that kind of stuff. Like that's the story. That's the whole story. And then for weeks he was like adding me all the time on Twitter where it's just like, you must talk about this on stream with me. Come on my stream. Why aren't you doing it? I was like, you were the most chill person in the world. What is all this? So eventually I was like, fine, you forced my hand. I'm gonna leak the DM where you said you'd spin this whole thing into a story and turn it into a whole drama unless I bent the knee to your will. Like you can either like apologize to me immediately or like I will turn this into a giant fiasco. And I was like, all right, have fun. You do you, but that's wild. That's wild behavior online. I don't know how long that'll be sustainable for.
After this round of peace talks in Istanbul, that they've made, the two sides have made huge progress. Tremendous kind of movement. A lot of this was
Dan Simpson, the chillest
kind of
person in the
cheerleading
world,
was being done by Turkish officials, for example, who have every reason to sort of trumpet the success of their own peace talks. But what appears to have happened is that the Russians said that they intend to reduce their military activity around Kyiv and also around Chernihiv, which is another northern Ukrainian city that's been effectively besieged and has been, been battered pretty hard by Russian artillery and airstrikes. They're going to they said they're going to kind of reduce their military activity in those regions. They characterize this as an effort to, and I'm going to quote here from the Deputy Russian Minister of Defense, Alexander Fomin, to increase mutual trust and create the necessary conditions for further negotiations and achieving the ultimate goal of, sort of a peace arrangement. So that's one area we're supposed to believe is serious progress. On the Ukrainian side, they went into these talks on Tuesday talking about their willingness to accept neutrality, basically, to agree not to join any military alliances, specifically NATO, but also other.
I can't believe this news. I feel redeemed. I felt bad for him for a minute when he banned me, but now I'm without bother at all. Nirvana and catharsis are mine. Like, honestly, I wish him well. I hope he sorts out whatever it is that he's working through, because I think it's pretty aggressive to be just attacking other content creators and then like even falsifying and fabricating stories and going to the extent because you're so passionate about this Nazi thing. Yeah, I don't know.
Military alliances to agree not to have bases on their territory that house foreign troops, not to engage in military exercises with other kind of partner militaries, except at in consultation with Russia. It sounds like there's some latitude there, but this is where I kind of have some not concerns but questions. They're only willing to do this if they get a security guarantee of some kind, and the details of that security guarantee are not fully available. It doesn't, it's unclear, for example, what countries would be asked to provide this guarantee. It would be some group of Western countries, basically. Turkey's been on the list. The United States has been floated. Canada, the UK. So, I mean, all your favorites.
Sounds like NATO.
It sounds like what the Ukrainians are asking for is basically a NATO-like commitment that if Russia were to come back 2 years from now or 5 years from now or whatever and invade Ukraine, that these countries would be treaty-bound to come to Ukraine's defense. I find it very hard to believe that the Russians would be willing to accept this, and yet that seems to be what's on the table. And as I say, this is being characterized as big step forward and progress. So basically, I mean, on these 2 points, what you have are the Russians announcing that they're going to do a thing, pulling back forces from Kyiv and Chernihiv that they're already doing. They were probably already doing for military reasons so that they could refocus on the Donbass. So I'm not sure how much of a concession that actually is. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians are offering neutral status under terms that I'm not sure Moscow would be prepared to accept.
The UN is live right
now. The
now.
other issues at play here, the final status of Crimea and the Donbass, the geographic sort of issues, it doesn't sound like they're anywhere close to finding common ground. And the Ukrainians are talking about, proposing a 15-year process to determine the final status of Crimea, which seems to me to be, long since lost to Russia. I mean, I don't think there's any coming back from that. And then, they've said some very vague things about talking about the final status of the Donbass, but even vaguer than this sort of nebulous 15-year process. So I'm a little skeptical about how much progress is actually being made here. But again, that's just me.
And I guess only time will tell, really, on this one.
Yes, as I said, there is evidence of Russian troop movements in the north, but whether that's a gesture of peace or just they're being redeployed to the Donbass, who knows? There is still this issue of the bulk of the Ukrainian military
15 years sounds like they're waiting for Putin
in the
to pass,
Donbass,
almost,
in a place where it would be relatively easy for the Russians, especially if they wrap up the siege of Mariupol, which looks like it may be in the final days or weeks. They're in control, it sounds like, of about half the city, and continuing to kind of press that advantage that they could, in theory, maneuver themselves to surround this most of the Ukrainian military, which is still in this region, which would be a big game changer. I mean, it would be a very serious very bitter pill for the Ukrainians to swallow, and I think would change the nature of the conflict if it happened. So there's still that floating around out here. So I think things are still fairly unsettled at this point.
Very interesting, Derek. Well, thanks for giving us an update on that. Why don't we actually go over to Pakistan, where it looks like there might be a new prime minister. All
right, so that's the update from American Prestige. Again, go check out American Prestige podcast. They're really good at doing breakdowns of everything, and I know it's very lefty. So some of you who aren't extreme lefties might be taken aback by the proposition. The first half of the podcast is almost always just fact based. It's just, here's reporting on the ground, and I'm going to explain what is happening, and here's what's happening and when it's happening. It's not like, and that's why, if we look at this from a material analysis perspective, and I can actually apply the Hegelian dialectic, we can truly see why Putin, in fact, it's not like that. It's just like, here's just the raw on the street stuff.
Мають бойовий досвід, і вони можуть нажати на курок. Ти бачиш, я кинув геолокацію?
In a defensive position on the frontier of Odessa, we're shown another reason for their confidence. A supply of US-made Javelin anti-tank missiles, which have been used with deadly effect
I got your link to
in
me.
battlefields
It's not really related
across
to what I'm showing
Ukraine.
This is the rockets for the Javelin.
Yes.
This is the launcher for the Javelin.
There's a launcher. There's the fighting system.
Вот такое положение. Сюда открывается, крепится ракета, вытаскивается с футляра, крепится ракета. И после этого мы делаем пуск.
These are gonna be used against the armored vehicles, tanks, and against helicopters.
Does Ukraine, do you have enough of javelins like these and other similar weapons?
Да, я думаю, что достаточно. У нас есть еще другие образцы противотанковых орудий.
As the soldiers prepare to face
He's
the
talking Russian, by the way, for anyone who
Russian
says
assault,
Russian is banned.
Odessa's musicians.
Isn't that Caleb Maupin's position? Isn't he like, he went on the convo couch and he has this whole speech where he's like, all right, imagine for a second, okay? There was a whole bunch of people who came here from Mexico, and then we banned Spanish as the language. All right? Now just imagine that. What would you say if that happened? Because that is what is happening in Ukraine, in the Donbass region. They're banning anyone from speaking Russian.
Stage a concert in front of the Opera House. The musicians are calling on NATO to close the skies over Ukraine. To come has emptied the city of most.
The claim that Ukraine banned most of the spoken language in the country is so stupid. Ukraine's laws are less severe than Quebec's language laws. So really? Yeah, but we shouldn't talk about mopping. We'll summon his very intense follower, who may or may not be mopping himself.
This elegant city, founded by Catherine the Great, has sandbagged its precious statues. Odessa cannot escape its Russian heritage. Is this the biggest crisis that Europe has faced since the Second World War?
I believe so. I still think that Yugoslavia conflict was local and of course cruel and criminal, but still it was different. It was without the direct engagement of a nuclear superpower. And at any time it did not put a risk of a global war, while this is the case.
How dangerous is this beyond the borders of Ukraine?
Very much dangerous. I think the inner circle of President Putin should take care that the red button is nowhere close to President Putin's fingers.
Vladimir Putin has overturned the old order. The stakes for Europe and the world are immense. The toll in human lives is mounting by the day and by the hour. In Odessa, as in many other cities, desperate survivors are at the railway station, waiting to escape a world they no longer understand.
Да, с Николаева. Мы сегодня приехали с Николаева. После двухнедельных обстрелов, особенно этой ночью, обстреляли, просто в город стреляли, мы решили ехать. Куда мы едем, мы не знаем.
Oh, that's really sad. Just give me 1 second here. I wanted to check out what was the latest on the ground news. As if I am someone who completely understands how to read every part of this. Joint Forces operation repelled 7 Russian attacks in Donetsk and Luhansk. Explosions reported near Zaporizhzhia. Red alert. Sirens sounding. Take cover now. Explosions reported near Sinyakov. Aerial sounds. It all just sounds horrifying and harrowing, and makes me very happy that I'm not currently in a location that's getting bombed and shelled. Take cover, take cover, take cover. Church was damaged. Russians destroying libraries. Satellite images refute Russia's claims that the killing of civilians in Bucha, a suburb of Ukraine's capital, occurred after its soldiers left town, a New York Times analysis found. This is a big one, by the way. If you haven't already heard, and well, I mean, you've probably seen some of the images online because they're absolutely horrifying, but immediately Russia tried to walk back the horrors and atrocities of what had occurred, where people were just found like strewn on the ground, civilians with their hands like handcuffed behind their backs, all killed, and saying that it wasn't us. This occurred afterwards, and it's kind of like, I guess, a psyop. But I was like, you probably, if a lot of this is happening, especially out in the open, there's going to be effective satellite imagery and photos and video even of what is occurring on the ground that could refute that immediately. And apparently the New York Times has released an analysis stating that Russia's attempting to occupy and conquer territory in eastern Ukraine. U.S. National Security Advisor, we are following up on atrocities and war crimes in Ukraine. Well, of course the U.S. is. It's going to be a bit of a Spider-Man meme there. Red Cross is saying that its team traveling to Mariupol has stopped. Civilian casualties, Russian shelling. More Russian shelling, more Russian shelling, more airstrikes. It's funny, sometimes when I just go through this website and just frequently just trying to see what all the latest news is on the ground, so much of it is just depressing. Bloated bodies are not recent deaths. Yeah, I mean, that explains it pretty well, right? An analysis of the satellite images by the New York Times rebutes the claims by Russia that the killing of civilians in Bucha, a suburb of Kiev, occurred after its soldiers had left the town. When images emerged over the weekend of the bodies of the dead civilians lying on the streets of Bucha, some of their hands had been bound, others had been gunshot wounds to the head. Russia's Ministry of Defense denied the responsibility. In a telegram post on Sunday, the ministry suggested that the bodies had been recently placed on the streets after all Russian units withdrew completely. Russia claimed that its images were another hoax and called for an emergency UN Security Council meeting on what provocations of Ukrainian radicals are doing in Bucha. But a review of the videos and the satellite imagery by the Times shows that many civilians were killed more than 3 weeks ago when Russia's military was in control of the town. One video filmed on location of a council member on April 2nd shows multiple bodies scattered along the Oblonska Street. Satellite images provided to the Times and Maxar Technologies show that at least 11 of those have been on the streets since March 11th, when Russia, by its own account, occupied the town. Yeah, which would explain the composition of the bodies. To confirm when the bodies appeared and when the civilians were likely killed, the visual investigation team at the Times conducted a before and after analysis of the satellite imagery. The images showed dark objects similar to the size of a human body appearing on the Oblonska Street between March 9th and March 11th. The object appears in a precise position in which the bodies were found after Ukrainian forces reclaimed Bucha. Footage from the April 2nd shows. Further analysis shows that the objects remained in those positions for over 3 weeks. The causes of death are unclear. Some of the bodies were beside what appears to be an impact crater. Others were near abandoned cars. 3 of the bodies lay beside bicycles. Some have their hands bound behind their backs with white cloth. The bodies were scattered over half a mile of the Oblonska Street. A second video shows more than 3 bodies. One lies beside a bicycle and an abandoned car. There are just some of the civilian bodies discovered since Saturday. The Associated Press published the images of at least 6 dead men lying together in the rear of an office building, some with hands tied behind their back. The building is 1 mile west of the other victims found against Oblonska Street. Another mile further along, the photographer with the Times discovered the body of a man with a gunshot wound to his head lying beside a bicycle. So it's, it would seem that it's not only like horrifying on its surface, but the fact that Russia is trying to deny after the fact that this actually wasn't us, that this was part of radical Ukrainians to set up, I guess, a bunch of cadavers to make us look bad, doesn't hold up to scrutiny at the end of the day.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we are prepared to conduct many a human sacrifices in your honor. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble yet incompetent jesters, trying in vain to bring some levity into your life. To our Lord Trevor R., we give you thanks for this meager plot of land for us to toil away our pathetic existence. To our brave knights, Carl Wauer, Tony, D.M. Rivera, Resident Scarecrow, Sir Nickus, Mayred, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruben Kelly, Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, Hegbert Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Jenna Tal, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Catherine, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Agent NDN, Violent Orchard, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We salute our mighty heroes off to conquest some bread in some far-off land.